Well, good evening and welcome tonight. As you're finding your seats, my name is Ben Dockery. I'm the Executive Director of the Lakelite Institute. And tonight, my privilege is to welcome you and to introduce our speaker, give you some updates on tonight. Those of you who are joining us online, we're thankful that you're here. Maybe you found this. There's a variety of ways you may have heard about this tonight, but if you're new to Lakelite, first, just thank you for coming. Thank you for being a part of one of the initiatives, one of the programs that we're offering. And you may have gone to the website and see there's articles and newsletters, and our first book came out, and we offer events and classes, and even doing some, for the second time, doing some study tours, immersive learning experiences, even about Lewis in Oxford this summer. I can tell you more about that at the end. But one of the things that we do, and this is the first time in 2024 we've had a chance to do this, is offer talks where we actually invite in experts in their field to come and to share with us what they have learned about a topic. And so I'll be introducing Dr. Jerry Root, who will be talking about C.S. Lewis, and specifically about Lewis and imagination here in just a moment. But the reason that we do what we do is that we know that there are lots and lots of questions that are going on in the world today. The modern world is filled with, in some ways, new questions that have never been asked in history. There's questions about AI and pharma and all sorts of things that tech and other things are forcing us to ask. Our kids are dealing with social media, ways that generations in the past have never done this. But we actually believe that one of the best ways to address these questions is to look for timeless wisdom for questions of modern life. Is not always to look forward, not always to look to today, but actually to look back. And that's what drives a lot of what we do. So we offer resources and learning opportunities in order to see what it is that the best of the Christian tradition, the best of the intellectual tradition, have offered the questions that are deeply human, to why we exist, why we do what we do, what's causing us to live in the world the way we do, and how is it that God is pointing a way forward. And so tonight is an example of that. One thing I will say as well is, just as a commercial, I'll give details on this at the end, is this isn't the first thing and only thing we're doing with C.S. Lewis. We're also going to be offering a class starting next week. I know many of you I've seen are already signed up for that class, so thank you for that. It starts on Tuesday night, and our pastor, Mike Woodruff, will be leading that class over the next five weeks. So know that that's coming. I'll give you details at the end. But let me, one other thing, as I introduce Dr. Root here, when you came in the lobby, you may have seen that there is a C.S. Lewis Institute table out there, and I cannot see KJ. KJ Johnson, are you here? He may still be out in the lobby, but KJ is the executive director there. He's waving his hand. Everybody say hello to KJ. Sorry for those of you online, you can't see this, but he's the director. He's the one who introduced us to Dr. Root. We said, this is the topic we want to do. This is what we want our people to be able to experience. Who should we look for? Who's the best in this area? And he said, Jerry Root. So we tried to get him to come August, September, or October of last year, and he was traveling out of the country, speaking on Lewis in places, every one of those. So we went back to KJ and said, who should we get for number 2? And he said, Jerry Root. You need to stay with him. So we moved our date and asked him to come in January, and so he is here with us. He's a graduate of Wheaton College in Southern California, where he played football, went on to the graduate school at Biola, where he did work in theology, and then at Open University is where he did his PhD. He's written extensively journal articles and books, mainly surfacing in and out of the world of C.S. Lewis. Books that include titles that you may have heard of, or some of you have read, C.S. Lewis, The Problem of Evil, The Neglected Lewis, and one that is specifically important to tonight, The Surprising Imagination of C.S. Lewis, that he did with Mark Neal. He's lectured in over 80 universities now and in almost 20 countries about this topic. I could go on, but I'm going to get out of the way and let him talk to you. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jerry Root.
Thank you, Ben. He didn't mention that I was a PE major in college, so nobody expected much from me. And if you're a former PE major, I'm not trying to embarrass you or anything like that. But sometimes it's good for us to remember where we came from, so we don't get full of errors, that sort of thing. A person told me after I graduated from college, you don't get an education in college, you lay a foundation for an education. Commencement means you'll now commence your education. Pick an author who will take you places and make him your life study. I think he could have said pick a composer, pick a period of history, pick an artist, whatever. but I selected Lewis. I think I could have done worse. He opens more than wardrobe doors. Reading him is itself a liberal arts education, if you go read the books he's referring to also. So I have found great encouragement in my reading of Lewis. And I'm happy to share with you the kinds of things we've picked up after a lifetime of study. But I want to begin with a word of prayer, if I might. Father, I'm very aware that I am very limited, that I'm a pea brain. I'm aware too, Father, that these people came to hear something and they wanted something for their souls this evening. I'm furthermore aware of how ridiculous it is to think that one person can stand in front of a room full of people who have various challenges in their hearts. Some are experiencing great joys right now. Some are experiencing real sorrows. Some are experiencing conundrums and confusions. They don't know how to deal with them. How can one person in a room full of people like this ever connect with all these hearts? But one time your son took something like crumbs, 5 loaves and 2 fish, before 5,000 people who were hungry. And he took those crumbs and broke them and blessed them and distributed them, and everybody left satisfied. Would you take the crumbs that are offered and let your Holy Spirit break them and bless them and distribute them in such a way that every person here would sense that he or she got exactly what each one needed to hear this evening. And we would recognize that we have been in your presence if that happens. And we thank you in advance. In your name, amen. I was talking to somebody just before we started, and there was a letter that C.S. Lewis wrote to a little girl in America 3 weeks before he died. It's one of the last things he penned. She was only 11 years old. She's on the threshold of her earthly experience. He's on the threshold of eternity. What did he write to her? And he said this to her: if you continue to love Jesus, nothing much will go wrong with you, and I pray you may always do so. And my hope for you as a result of this evening is that you will have a more refreshed and more robust interest in wanting to know and love Jesus after our evening tonight. We're talking about C.S. Lewis and the imagination. The word imagination, if we were to define it, just simply means image making. Somebody might say, well, how does that fit with the second commandment? You shouldn't make any images. Well, the key is you can make images, but you can't make idols. And if you made an image that you then began to worship, something's wrong. And C.S. Lewis was very clear about this, that we make images, but the thing is, if you begin to worship it, God always kicks out the walls of temples we build for him because he wants to give us more of himself. He doesn't want us to get stuck in a rut. He doesn't want to make idols of present understandings. And so there's no problem with the imagination. As a matter of fact, God infuses with the Holy Spirit, the first people in the Bible ever filled with the Holy Spirit, Bezalel and Oholiab, who he gives the ability to make creative works of art for the tabernacle in the Old Testament. So image making is okay, but idolatry is not. So why is the imagination important? Well, I would suggest to you there's no growth in our understanding about anything without some use of the imagination. And the scientists will quickly tell us that. How does the scientific method begin? With a hypothesis, an imaginative thought about, well, let's explore this. What about this? And so on. And then when they find something through their investigation, what do? They cast what they've discovered with models. These are not the thing itself. They're imaginative depictions. And it was Thomas Kuhn in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, who said science is always emerging because new data is always coming in and the paradigms constantly have to be shifting. And imagination is involved in the sciences as well. Furthermore, I would suggest to you need the imagination because there's no last words about anything you think. If I said to you, this is a pen, that may be true. I may know enough about pens to have a sure word about that pen and a confident word I can say about it. But it has a length, it has a width, it has a molecular structure, it has a history. It comes from the iron stylus, it comes from the feathered quill pen, it comes from the fountain pen, the ballpoint pen. This happens to be a gel pen. It has a function. how it writes on paper, how it writes on cardboard, how it writes on paper smeared with butter, not very well. In other words, I could go on and on and on about this, and it's just a pen. I can have a sure word, but no last word. I can speak at it with confidence, and I hold that confidence with humility, because I'll probably never get to the bottom of what this is and all its function in history. Sure words, not last words. Sure words, confidence, no lack of humility in the process. And that means I'm always going to be using the imagination to stretch and grow into regions I don't yet understand. Furthermore, I'm going to need the imagination because I have the capacity to deceive myself. There's a term that was coined by Aristotle called akrasia or akrasia. It comes from the Greek word krasia, which means command. You put the alpha negation on it, and it means losing command of something. The word is actually co-opted by some of the New Testament writers in the New Testament as well in the Greek text. And what happens is if I do a bad thing, I'm at a risk. I can repent of that bad thing. I can change my behavior. If I do not, to live with myself, I'll have to rationalize and justify that behavior. That's akrasia. It's to lose command of my moral life through self-deception and so on. And consequently, I think we need the imagination because of that problem, and I'll explain how. You've got Lewis, he wrote, continued disobedience to conscience makes conscience blind. Aristotle said vice is unconscious of itself, and the Apostle Paul said we suppress truth in our unrighteousness. How do you break through? Imagination helps us. George MacDonald, an author who influenced C.S. Lewis, once wrote, we do not have souls. We are souls. We have bodies. You could tell a child he has a soul and he thinks like anything else he has, his keys, his books, his coat. He could leave it someplace and he goes off. We think the child begins to think he goes to the grave and his soul goes off someplace else. No, MacDonald says tell the child he is a soul and he has a body. And when he dies, he goes to heaven and he leaves his body behind like clipped hair on a barbershop floor, for those of you that still go to barbershops. What makes up the soul? I think I could make a good defense for it. We could talk about that maybe later. But I would simply say to you, traditionally we say it has this immaterial part of what it is to be human, and it has a thinking part, the reason, it has a choosing part, the will, and it has a feeling part, the emotion. Hands down, reason is the weakest of these. Why do I say that, even coming from an academic environment? Because if I make a bad choice with my will, I will begin to rationalize that bad choice into moral blindness, as I've just said. If I am wounded emotionally, my reason doesn't kick in and say, Jerry, you need to grieve that and forgive the person who hurt you so you don't become embittered and it begins to cause your life to become corroded. No, my reason, being weak, eclipses and masks that and some sort of cyst on my soul filling with pus. You bump into me, I'll bleed a little pus in your area. And so my reason, being weak, doesn't serve me well. I've got to be careful. And George MacDonald, and then C.S. Lewis after him, says, reason stands like dragon sentries in front of my heart, keeping truth often from getting through. And Lewis asks, how do you get past the dragon sentries? And here again is the use of the imagination. It's often through story. It's often through, you think of Nathan in the Bible. He's told to go tell David, David, your adultery and your murder to cover it up is not appropriate. What would you do? He's already killed one person to cover it, and now Nathan has to go deliver the message. How's he going to break through and get past the watchful dragons? He tells a story to David. And David hears tangentially the story, makes his judgment, and Nathan says, you're the man. You're the man. Jesus, he's talking to people who have eyes but cannot see, ears that cannot hear. What does he do? He starts telling parables, stories, to get past the watchful dragons. And furthermore, the value of the imagination, we have a tendency towards self-referentialism, and it keeps us from seeing things more broadly, seeing the world as big as it is, because we're in some ways, not because of moral brokenness, but just stuck in a rut, because we don't often see beyond our perspective. Some people talk about the Western perspective. You know, you'll see a picture of Jesus. Years ago, you used to see this, and he'd be blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus, you know. People say this is crazy. Why do Americans do this? Have you been to very many other countries? If you go down to Latin America, guess what? They paint Jesus and he looks like a Hispanic person. If you go to Asia, he looks like an Asian. We all have this tendency to see world from our perspective at the moment. Have you ever seen people complain about the fact that if we have an atlas, America's right in the middle of the atlas? Oh, those Americans are so self-referential and so on. But I was in Uganda one time, and here was a store, and there was an atlas, and Uganda was in the very middle. You go to Scandinavia. Scandinavia's in the very middle. We all do this. But because we do it, there's a tendency for us to be stuck in a rut. And we need to break out and see a wider world. John Godfrey Sachs, in his poem, Six Blind Men and the Elephant, he's got these 6 blind men. They've palled around for a long time. They come upon an elephant. They've heard of elephants before. They've never encountered one. One grabs the leg and says, I got it. An elephant's like a tree trunk. Other one's up against the side and says, no, an elephant's like a wall. Another one has a tail and says, no, an elephant's like a rope. Another one has a tusk and says, it's wood-like and it's curved and it's got a point. It's like a curved spear. Another one has a hold of the trunk and says, no, you guys are all wrong. It's like a giant anaconda snake. Another one has the ear and says, no, it's like a fan. What do? They have to begin with the perspective of believing the other people aren't crazy. And one of them maybe yells out to his friend and says, grab my hand. Pull me into your experience. Help me to see what you see imaginatively. And you say, wow, it's like a wall too. Come feel what I felt. Look, it's like a tree trunk too. Now these two, beginning to trust more, go around the elephant and say, wow, this is a complex thing. And a willingness to listen to another and the employment of the imagination helps us get the bigger picture. That's the point. It was Basil Mitchell who once said, whatsoever credit or authority we give to any proposition more than it receives from the principles and proofs it supports itself on is owing to our inclination that way. How do we break out of these ruts that we sometimes dig for ourselves? Imagination helps. It was Charles Williams, one of the Inklings, who was a very close friend of C.S. Lewis, says, not one mind in 1,000 can be trusted to state accurately what its opponent says, much less what he thinks. And this is amazing, I think. And it shows us that sometimes the self-referentialism requires some imaginative development to think beyond what we presently know and what is presently accessible to us by virtue of our experience. C.S. Lewis said, in coming to understand anything, we must reject the facts as they are for us in favor of the facts as they are. If we neglect that, we could stand on a railroad track and actually think that the track narrows as it moves further away from us. We need to break out of that. Now, how might Lewis help us then in cultivating the life of the imagination? He said of himself, the imaginative man in me is older, more continuously operative, and in that sense more basic than either the religious writer or the critic. It was he who made me first attempt, with little success, to be a poet. It was he who, in response to the poetry of others, made me a critic, and in defense of that response, sometimes a critical controversialist. It was he who, after my conversion, led me to embody my religious beliefs in symbolical or mythopoeic forms, ranging from screw tape to a kind of theologized science fiction. And it was, of course, he who brought me in the last few years to write the series of Narnian stories for children. Lewis was a citizen of the world of the imagination. In my 54 years of studying his writing, I've found 31 different ways he expresses the imagination. Some of them are negative, some of them are positive. But those, we can talk about that maybe later in the Q&A time, because it's complex. But I did a book, The Surprising Imagination of C.S. Lewis, and it's very insightful and very helpful to see what he says about it. So now I want to take one area of the imagination and see if in the little bit of time we have left, if I could develop it somewhat for you. Lewis was a gifted and practiced in his use of the imagination. He was a skilled logician, but both Evelyn Underhill and Oxford University philosopher Austin Farah said his real skill was in depiction. If you've read the Mere Christianity, you've seen him set forth some philosophical or theological point, and then what does he do? He gives a little image, he gives a little illustration, and all of a sudden you meet what he's saying with your mind, but you also meet it with your heart as you engage through that illustration. And this capacity of his imaginative skill was on display in his works of poetry, in his works of science fiction, satires, novels, but fantasy. And lacking the time to fully develop his imaginative skill across the wide range of his writing, I'd like to invest the rest of our time to focus on one area of his imaginative abilities, and that would be, again, his fantasy. He wrote often about his intention in this. There's one book called This and Other Worlds. It's fascinating, lots of essays. You could see what he thinks. But he was best of friends with J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien gave a lecture at St. Andrews University on fairy stories right after the publication of The Hobbit. It hadn't been published. Lewis liked it. Their friend Charles Williams died. Lewis does a work called Essays Presented to Charles Williams, and he said to Tolkien, publish this in this book. And Lewis says about that essay, it's the best thing he had read on fantasy. And many of the ideas depicted by Tolkien are also written about by Lewis, but I'm going to use Tolkien to help us get through this because it will be strung together in an inferentially coherent and understandable way. He basically says there are 6 features of the fairy story that this kind of writing embellishes for us or reveals to us. C.S. Lewis wrote, the man who writes a love sonnet not only loves the sonnet, but he not only loves the beloved, but also loves the sonnet. He picks a literary form that helps him to say what he wants to say. He wrote an essay, sometimes fairy stories say best what needs to be said. You pick the form like an artist might pick the frame of a painting. So consequently, here are the 6 areas. Number 1 is embellishment. Embellishment. How many of you remember when you were in elementary school, your teacher telling a story about stone soup? Stone soup. Maybe it was bone soup or nail soup. Do you remember the story? Soldiers are coming back from the wars. People knew that they had to billet the soldiers. It was part of their taxes. They didn't want to do that. It was disruptive to them. And this kid comes to the marketplace and he says, there's soldiers coming up the road, and all the people pack up, go into their houses, close the shutters, and the soldiers arrive there, and they've been to a situation like this before. And what do? Boy, George, I am so hungry I could eat a horse. Do you remember last night when you made us that stone soup? And the villagers are, stone soup, what's that? If we had that, we won't have to plant, we won't have to harvest, we won't have to do all that work. What's stone soup? And so they get a big bucket cauldron, they get water from the little river that's running outside the village, and they get a fire going, and the water's starting to boil, and George pulls out a velvet pouch and he drops a stone in the cauldron, and he goes, oh, I can taste it now. And one of the soldiers said, yeah, but last night it was so good when it had carrots in it. One of the townspeople, so curious now, pops open the shutters and says, I've got carrots! Runs down, they cut up the carrots and put it in. And then he's looking in the pot too. And another one says, it was so good last night when it had onions. I've got onions! Another one says, it was really good with ox meat. I've got ox meat! Pretty soon the whole town are coming down and contributing to the cauldron. And all of a sudden, the people start getting excited, and they bring out the lanterns across the town square, and the little town band comes out, and they start playing. They set up picnic tables, and all of a sudden, it's no longer stone soup, it's stone stew. And they all eat, and then they fight over each other, who gets to take the person into their house that night, and they have such a great time together. And Tolkien says that's what story is like. One generation embellishes to the next generation and embellishes through new imaginative development. It's important. And we can see examples of it constantly. Lewis writes essays about it. What Chaucer really did to Il Filostrato, the genesis of a medieval book, and the discarded image, he writes about it. And in some senses, we do it in our own world too. What was West Side Story? A retelling of Romeo and Juliet. What was The Lion King? A retelling of Hamlet. What was Bridget Jones' Diary? It was Pride and Prejudice retold. And if you didn't get it, Colin Firth played a character named Darcy in both pictures. And consequently, what do? The director's hitting us over the head with a 2x4. I'm just retelling the old story, embellishing it in new ways. Lewis practiced it himself. The Great Divorce, a satirical retelling of the Divine Comedy. Voyage of the Dawn Treader, a youthful fantasy of the Odyssey, Prince Caspian, Hamlet retold, Pilgrim's Regress borrows from Pilgrim's Progress, and on it goes. Embellishment is one of the big things in fantasy, using the imagination to take it further and apply it maybe to a fresh challenge. Next one is prohibition. And here they borrow from G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton said in his book Orthodoxy, positive joy exists on condition. The fairy stories were in some senses also not only to delight children, but to instruct children. Positive joy exists on condition. What do you mean by that? Well, the fairy stories always exhibit some sort of obstacle or barrier that you can't get over or you shouldn't get over and get beyond. Now, Cinderella, you can go to the ball, but you better be back before midnight. Pandora, you can have the box. Don't open the box. You ever hear a story sort of like that? You young couple here that I just created, you can be in this garden, but you can't eat from one tree. And the thing that is the barrier keeps us from that which will harm us. But instead of putting our noses up against the fence, we turn our back to the fence and we see the playground that's defined by the fence. Something we might not understand through just moral instruction, but the fairy story or the imaginative development can say, I think I get this. That thing's going to hurt me. This thing's going to give me joy. I think I want to keep my nose in this direction rather than that direction. And the next thing, we got embellishment, prohibition, then you've got fantasy. And the point of fantasy is it awakens desire, and ultimately it awakens desire for other worlds. And you've got this in so many stories. What is it with Virgil, with the Aeneid? Aeneas is a citizen of Troy. His city's been destroyed by the Greeks. A prophecy's been uttered that he should flee and build a new city. And what's the city he's going to build? Rome. Matter of fact, the word romantic comes from that story of the Aeneid. And he's a man caught between the two cities, the city of his birth and the city that will one day be. Augustine was no fan of the old myths. He liked that one because he thought it was indicative of our own lives. We're born and citizens of one country, but we have a longing for something else, something that we grope for. And Lewis says that the fantasy is to awaken that desire. When a child hears a good night story, a great good night story, what do they say as soon as it's over? Read it again. Why? They already know the story. They know the twists and turns of plot. There's no more surprise at the end. But Lewis says the story, if it was a good one, awakens in the child's heart a longing for another world. And ultimately a longing for the only other world they could ever really know, which is heaven itself. So there's fantasy that comes from these things. And there's much more we could say about that also after this discussion. We could develop that much further. The next one is recovery. So we've got embellishment, prohibition, and we've got fantasy and recovery. Recovery is to regain a clear view of something, to see things as they are, not as we would have them be. We've all heard the phrase, familiarity breeds contempt. We have these things about us that maybe one day in our life they awaken wonder and awe in us. But now they're so familiar, we don't pay any attention to them. Remember how it was when it was Christmas? You'd open the presents under the tree. My parents were cool about this. They would always let us go to bed that night with one present. Isn't that great? So you're playing with the present all that Christmas day into the night. You wake up in the morning and you happen to notice that your brother's got presents too. And all of a sudden we break the 10th commandment because we start coveting for our siblings' presents. And after about 3 or 4 days, we're not even playing with the present that we got anymore. Familiarity breeds contempt. And we can do that in our relationships too. I've performed over 900 weddings in my life. I've never seen a couple at the altar that weren't making eyes at each other. And yet sometimes you can go to a restaurant. Back when you used to be able to smoke in restaurants, you'd often see the guy sitting there at the window with a newspaper up, like the wall of Jericho. And his wife sitting on the other side, smoking a cigarette, looking out the window. And you go, wow, there was a day when they were making eyes at each other. What happened? Familiarity breeds contempt. Recovery in the stories awakens us again to be revived in our sense of awe and wonder of the people we meet, the places we go, and so on. I'll give you an example of this. In George MacDonald's original version of The Princess and the Goblin, the original. If you buy a copy now, you're not going to get this. Somebody in 1927 at the Lippincott publication edited out all the Christian elements of this book. It was tragic. But here's the way MacDonald first told it. Come to the Wade Center at Wheaton College. We have all this material there. You could go research it yourself. But nevertheless, it begins with the author telling the story, and he's interrupted. Author: there once was a princess who... Oh, but Mr. Author, why do you always write about princesses? Well, because every little girl is a princess. Oh, you'll make them vain if you tell them that. Not if they understand what I mean. Well, then what do you mean by a princess? What do you mean by a princess? Well, I mean the daughter of a king. Very well then. Every little girl is a princess and is always at risk of forgetting her rank and acting as if she had grown up out of the mud. That is why little girls need stories about princesses told to them. Isn't that great? My word. So anyway, this is the idea of recovery. And I think this is huge in Lewis, and it's huge in Tolkien, and it's huge in our whole understanding of imaginative development. I want to say a couple of other things. Lewis says, in coming to understand anything, again, we must reject the facts as they are for us in favor of the facts as they are. We want to begin to see things as they are, not as we must have them be. Matter of fact, ask yourself, why do you have to have it be like that? The next area of fantasy is escape. And Lewis is very descriptive about this. He says it's not the escape of the deserter. It's not the person who's going to books to try and escape the problems in this life. It's the escape instead of the prisoner, not the deserter. It is the exercising of the longing to break out of the dungeon of self-referentialism and self-centeredness, to break out of the dungeon of materialism, whose value of survival of the fittest prevents us from living purposeful lives beyond mere self-interest, so that we can begin to see and offer in service our lives for others. Charles Williams, Lewis's friend, wrote about the high courtesy of heaven. And what did he say of the high courtesy of heaven? It's modeled in Jesus' death on the cross, where he says, I offer my life for you. My life for you. And escape helps us to break out of those things. I've got an elegant thing that Lewis wrote about it, but just out of economizing time, we can maybe talk about that after the presentation, the Q&A time. The last area is consolation. Consolation. It is one of the descriptive characteristics of the use of imagination and fantasy is that it gives the reader hope. What are the last lines of a good fairy story? And they all lived happily ever after. It has hope. Tolkien coined the term eucatastrophe. We're going to have our bumps and bruises in this fallen world. We might cause bumps and bruises for others. But a real understanding not only of the fairy story, but understanding a world made by a God who sovereignly reigns over that world and is ultimately bringing all things around to his ultimate purpose. It ends in the catastrophe that comes about to a good end. Eucatastrophe. Hope. It's not mere wishful thinking. It's not mere wishful thinking. It is rooted in the fundamental reality that God is God and his purposes will prevail. I was sharing with a group of us at dinner before that I went through a real difficult PhD process. I don't know of anybody who goes through a PhD process that doesn't have a story or two to tell. And I remember when I finally defended my dissertation, I didn't feel real good about it for probably 2 years. You know, it was tough. And I was with 3 friends, and we were in London, and we were book hunting. And the first friend, as we went into this one bookstore, says, do you have any books by C.S. Lewis? Well, he's asking for them, so I can't ask for them. The other guy said, well, do you have any books by Tolkien? He asked for it, so I can't ask for it. So by default, I said, do you have any books by George MacDonald? was the right thing to ask, because the guy said, actually, I have a book here by George MacDonald that he signed, and he wrote in it a poem that's never been published. And this is right after my coming off this difficult PhD process. I said, I'd like to see the book. And here was the poem. Go not forth to call thy sorrow from the dim fields of tomorrow. Let her roam there all unheeded. She will come when she is needed. But when she draws nigh thy door, she will find God there before. That's the eucatastrophe. It's not denying that there's bumps and bruises, but it has the hopeful eye. And the child who is steeped in the development of the imagination and fantasy, and the adult as well, it engenders in us a sense of hope and consolation. Lewis's use of the imagination employed in fantasy and fairy tale is merely one small example of how the imagination can open up one's mind and heart to the ways of God in our world and build hope in each of our lives. So I'll say that as far as right now. And Mike, if you want to come up. By the way, Mike's real name is Michael. And it's the name of the archangel, and it means who is like God. So any of you who ever call him Michael, expect the answer, nobody. So let's give a hand to Dr. Root. Hey, Michael. So I'll say in front of everybody what I said this afternoon when we met, and that is you win in that you've had 54 years of reading Lewis and 44 years of teaching Lewis around the world, 80 universities in 20 countries. And that just strikes me as a huge privilege and an opportunity, and you know, to read and to reflect and to think. And there's days when I think I go to meetings. That's my job. I go to staff meetings, and I go to prayer meetings, and I go to elder meetings, and I go to planning meetings, and I go to budget meetings. You get to read C.S. Lewis, so I'll just, you know, okay, you win. My mother was always shocked by it, though. She died a few years back, and I lost half my reading audience when she passed away. but she would always look at these books and say, what happened? He didn't even know how to spell. Right, well. So I don't take myself too seriously. Well, thank you for what you've done. So I want to just start by saying, could Lewis imagine this? So it's a cold night in December in Chicago. He's been dead for 60 years. I think I heard him say that he thought he would die out pretty quickly and nobody would be paying attention to him shortly after he died. And yet it seems as though his fame grows. Would he imagine this? No, he wouldn't have imagined this. He told Walter Hooper, who was his kind of private secretary the last few months, maybe month and a half or so, before he died, but then became his executor, his literary executor. He told Walter Hooper, I imagine that my books will all be out of print within 3 years. So Hooper started gathering up essays that Lewis had written in journals that would have drifted into obscurity. And he got them together and he put them under common cover, and he'd go to a publisher and he would say, I'll give you this new Lewis book to publish, because Lewis's popularity was still fairly strong at the time of his death. I'll give you this new Lewis book to publish if you bring out 2 books that have gone out of print. And Walter Hooper was the one who made sure he was in print. And then as more and more people did scholarly work on Lewis, they started talking about him, and it spread like wildfire. Yeah. Well, I'm teaching this class. It starts in a week, and I taught a class. The last class I taught on Lewis was 25 years ago. And I come back to my notes, and I start to look around about 6 months ago, and I'm like, okay, I got to catch up on this. And I discover, while I'm not watching, although he's been dead, more books keep coming out by Lewis. I'm like, oh my goodness, he's published 10 books since he died, maybe more than that. And then all these people do PhDs on him, and the Lewis world grows and it expands. And then I realized that
you have Lewis, who's famous for his fiction, whether it's children's fiction, the Chronicles, or it's the adult space trilogy fiction. And then you've got, or Screw Tape, or Great Divorce. And then you got Lewis, who's famous for Christian theology, nonfiction theology. And then you got Lewis, who's famous, really, I mean, I just didn't understand how distinguished he was as an academic in literary criticism and medieval studies and philosophy. And then now the big surprise is everybody's fascinated with his life. Yeah. And so you've got movies coming out on his marriage, and movies coming out on his friendship with Tolkien, and movies coming out on, I went to see the movie on Freud that came out just a couple days ago with Anthony Hopkins. You've seen that?
I haven't seen the movie. I've seen the play and I've read the play.
Okay.
But I didn't see the Hopkins thing yet.
Well, Hopkins, who of course, ironically, played Lewis before, he's now playing Freud in this one, so he's been on both sides of that debate. It's a little dialogue dense, but it's, but again, it's just sort of like, okay, Lewis is fascinating to people because of his life, in addition to all these other things. He wouldn't have imagined that.
No, there was a professor at Harvard. He was the dean of the School of Psychiatry. His name was Armin Nicolai. He was a believer. And he wanted to teach a class on the conflict between materialism and supernaturalism. And he felt the greatest exponent of materialism of the 20th century was Freud, and the greatest exponent of supernaturalism was Lewis. So he taught a class called Freud and C.S. Lewis. And he would interview the students to go in, and he always kept it so that there were a third Christian, a third materialist, and a third people who didn't know what they were. He didn't tip his hand as to what he was. I knew students who took the class. I knew Nicolai even. And that film comes out of that. They know Freud. He committed suicide. I don't know if you knew that. But 2 weeks before he committed suicide, he had his last counseling appointment, and it was with an Oxford Dom, but they didn't know who it was.
Right.
So the playwright says, what if we take Nicolai's concepts and we bring them out and we put these two in play with each other? Interestingly enough, did you guys read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? And you know how the children are billeted through different places? They leave London during the bombing and they're put up. Lewis took in people. He was a professor who took in children. One of the children was a woman named Jill Fluitt. And every child who stayed with him during the war, he paid for their tuition for college. Amazingly generous guy. Matter of fact, he was notorious for giving money away. One time a panhandler came up to him and asked him for money, and he just emptied his pockets. The panhandler, the guy who was with him, said, what'd you give that guy money for? He's just going to go drink it. And Lewis said, yeah, but if I kept it, I would drink it.
I would drink it too, yes. Yeah.
So Jill Fluitt went on to marry Sigmund Freud's grandson. And Lewis stayed close friends with Jill Fluitt and her husband, and they would often go to dinner together and so on. Isn't that ironic?
Yeah. Well, spoiler alert to the movie, it sort of plays to a draw, Lewis and Freud going back and forth, but in terms of the arguments, but Freud comes off looking much worse. Lewis is very patient, Freud is depressed and so full of contradictions in his life and his theories and everything else. So it's a little, he's a little desperate, but I would have liked a little stronger arguments from Lewis. Lewis is just sort of loving and caring with this guy who's clearly dying, and he figures that out. So, yeah. Well, so, by the way, one of the other surprises that I've had, and you sort of allude to it with this Nicolai saying that, yeah, one of the greatest proponents, one of the advocates, one of the greatest people to critique materialism and to argue for an objective reality is Lewis.
Wait, he
critiquing materialism. Yes, I'm sorry, but I was surprised to see the attention being given to the abolition of man. When I read it 30 years ago, one, I didn't get it, and I just thought, I mean, this debate at the beginning between two people looking at a waterfall, and one calls them sublime, and the other one calls it pretty, and Lewis says, if you call it pretty, all of Western civilization is going to collapse. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And I just didn't understand much of what was going on there. But I'm a little bit aware now that lots of people are looking at the abolition of man or that hideous strength an example of Lewis using his imagination to sort of smuggle truth under the radar, as you've talked about, that lots of people are now looking at this book and saying, oh yeah, this is the guy who sort of called what was going to happen.
In an age of great subjectivity, self-referentialism, relativism, Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, shows why objectivity must be something we embrace and develop and cultivate in our own thinking. Go back to the image of the waterfall. In this book, Lewis takes a passage from Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It's an event in his life, but it's actually from Dorothy Wordsworth's Grassmere Journals, 1803. And they went to the Coralline waterfall on the River Clyde. And Coleridge is there, and he says, the waterfall, he sees two tourists there, and one of them says, the waterfall is pretty. The other one says, the waterfall is sublime. It's a Platonic ideal of what a waterfall should be. And Coleridge assented to the one who said it was sublime and didn't like the one who said it was pretty. Neither of them were saying something negative about the waterfall, but one had a more robust description. With the authors of this book that Lewis is taking to task, it's a children's school book that he thinks all kinds of ideas are being smuggled into kids' minds, and they need to be alerted to what's going on in these textbooks. He said the problem is, they said Coleridge had no right to make that judgment. Well, the deal is, what was the basis of his judgment? Lewis says, all judgments imply a standard. What was the standard? Objective reality. The waterfall was there. If he would have said it was an elephant, it would have been discounted because there was no elephant there. That which is implied by a true statement needs reality to support the claim. And in areas of thought, it's a definition that we set forth, and we begin to think inferentially from that definition. So they said the objective reality doesn't matter. They severed the opinion from... Truth is not reality, people. Truth is what I think about reality when I think accurately about it. This is a pen. That's true. There's a reality that supports the claim. So the problem is, Gaius and Titius are still making judgments, the authors of this Green Book. Gaius and Titius are making judgments about what Coleridge said, but they've denied the very basis for making judgments at all. So the judgment's utterly self-referential. And if I can get power, it becomes tyrannical and controlling. Lewis, you used the word today when we were talking about that. He was so pressing, so foreknowing. He's writing this in the early 40s, and he's writing in a book he wrote imaginatively about that hideous strength. You read those two books together, and you say, he's describing what we're living right now. It's very interesting. So that's why people are interested in it, because Lewis is giving them definition and helping them put in words what they're feeling and thinking right now. Is that fair?
That's very fair, and it's, yes. And I guess, to take it one step further. So Lewis writes, 80 years ago, he writes this book. It's lectures, and then he turns it into a book, and then the Abolition of Man is 3 lectures that he turns into a book, and then That Hideous Strength is the novel. He sort of turns it into a story to sort of play out this idea of moving away from objective truth into a subjective world.
Right.
So, what would Lewis say today? I mean, if Lewis were here, would he like the world? Would he be a curmudgeon? Would he be, I told you so? Would he be, I mean, so much has changed in the last 80 years. He writes these science fiction novels, and so he's got this imagination, your topic, and yet it's turned out in some ways in very broken ways. So what do you think he would be saying if he was talking?
Well, a lot of times when people say, what do you think Lewis would say if he showed up today? And what you end up getting is somebody using Lewis as a ventriloquist uses his dummy and saying their ideas through Lewis. But I do think, though, that we could go to some of the things he did right that are relevant today, like these books you've just been talking about. And I think he would probably echo that. And I think imaginatively, he would probably develop further applications of it so we'd see its relevance in today, especially when we've been blinded by the things that are so up close to our perspective. He would help us see wider. That's what I think he would do. But because he's already written about it, I think we could say he would probably repeat the same things. Lewis was a classicist. Lewis was deeply influenced by classical thinking, deeply influenced by theology. And I think that was the skeletal structure after his conversion on which he fleshed out most of what he wrote. He said, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. So I think that whatever he would do, he would bring that same skeletal structure to the challenges of our day and maybe flesh it out in some of the unique ways that it would need to be fleshed out by today's circumstances. Is that fair?
You're the expert. I'm very willing to learn and defer. Let me pivot a little bit and say, from the work that you've been doing on imagination, and reading about Lewis's life and conversion recently, I'm struck by the fact that I think of Lewis, and in my interaction with Lewis, you said at some point, which I would agree, he gives vocabulary to my soul. He sort of comes along and it's like, oh my goodness, yes, this is what I'm thinking. He's helped make it clear. He's used his imagination in his fiction to create these brilliant characters that you get to sort of follow, whether it's the, Aslan or the White Witch or Reepicheep or whoever it is. But he also just tells stories or illustrations that you go, oh, now I get it, and very helpful. But to my way of thinking, very reasoned, very rational, very linear, very logical. So his apologetic, he's always sort of pointing out things like, you want to say this, but once he explains it, you can't say that. You can only say these things, and he makes it very clear. So I was drawn to Lewis initially because of the apologetic framework and the very reasoned. I look back on Lewis and I go, there's not as much scripture here as I would have thought. I mean, he's channeling it, he's writing from it, but he only writes, I think, on the Psalms. I don't see him write other stuff, but maybe I'm wrong.
No,
but it's also, he seems to have been won to faith by arguments other than the ones that he's giving to me that I'm so excited about. Does that make sense?
Not quite, but
okay.
he's won to faith by two things. One is he has these longings, and he's haunted by the longings. And his life was a quest to find the object of the longings. His favorite fairy story was The Golden Key by George MacDonald, where this boy named Mossy is told if he finds a rainbow and he digs at the base of the rainbow, he'll find a golden key. And he finds one and he says, but what's it to? What's the lock that fits the golden key? And it sets him on a quest. And Lewis liked that because he knew the longing of having the golden key and looking for the objects. That's one side of the equation. The other side was that he was a very reasonable and rational guy. And he was steeped in Greek and Latin philosophy and so on. And he had a mind that was very, very good. He's a great logician. And consequently, he wanted to understand things that fit. And how do you bring these two things? He wrote in one of his books, the first object in life, or the first question in life, is how do you fit the stone in the shell? And the image comes from the Prelude by Wordsworth, where a Bedouin shepherd has a stone in one hand that represented reason, and a shell in the other hand that represented the longings of the heart. How do you fit them together? Lewis says that's the first problem in life, but it's a problem since the fall. The fall estranged us from God, it estranged us from one another, and it estranged us even from ourselves. Soul and body, mind and heart, and so on. So Lewis was in the quest to find that, and he starts reasoning his way back by looking at his atheism, seeing it was incompatible with how life really is. and he saw the incongruities. It was unreasonable. He saw the materialism that supported his atheism, and he saw it was unreasonable. He went through the morass of agnosticism. He finally gets to the issue of if there's a theological answer, what religion is there? And he worked his way deliberately through it. It's all documented in his Surprised by Joy. And you can see the steps, very reasonable. But it was also prompted by the longing and the desire to find the object.
Yes, I guess what has got I go back to the famous interaction he has with Tolkien, where Tolkien says, the reason you're drawn to the Norse stories, the reason you're drawn to these myths is because they're true, and Christianity is the true myth, and that doesn't resonate with me. I get it looking at it from the other side, but it's not like, okay, I'm gonna become a Christian because of that.
Let me see if I can give you an answer to that.
Okay.
Is it okay?
Oh, please.
The Greek word muthos simply means story. And he's saying, you like these stories when you read them. Even in the old myths, they have dying gods, gods who come down, descend, and die, and so on. And he says, you like it when you read it in the myths. How come you don't like it at the one place where it reports to be true? Lewis would eventually write an essay called The Myth That Became Fact. And he, just a few weeks before Tolkien and he had that long conversation that caused Lewis to say Tolkien was the human cause of his conversion, he was reasoning about these things. When he finally got to the end of his rope, he thought, I don't think I could know God personally any more than Hamlet could know Shakespeare. But after his discussion about the true myth, he came up with this conclusion. If Hamlet could ever know Shakespeare,
write himself into the story.
It couldn't depend upon Hamlet breaking out, but Shakespeare could have written himself into the story, and he says, I think that's what happened. And right after that, he becomes a Christian. And he actually believed that the myths were to the pagan societies what the Old Testament was to the Jews, tutors to lead them to Christ. And this is another interesting thing. When our kids were young, we let them watch movies only on the weekends. They didn't watch television during the week, during school year. And one Saturday we were watching with them the Jungle Book, Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book, the Disney version. And at the end, where Baloo throws himself in harm's way and saves Mowgli from the tiger, Shere Khan, it looks like he died. And Bagheera the panther's walking off with Mowgli, looking back at the limp body of their friend. And Bagheera says, greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for a friend. I go, that just doesn't sound like Kipling to me. So I blew the dust off my Jungle Book, and it's not in there. It's in John 15. I'm curious about this. Years later, I'm asked to come give lectures to all the Disney artists. And they would sit in this big auditorium held about 400 people. And they all came in, they'd give them a box lunch, and once a month they'd bring in somebody to talk about story to keep them fired up about what they're doing. And they have 45-minute lecture, 45 minutes Q&A, and then they go back to work. And they told me, we know Lewis and Tolkien were Christians. If you have to mention it, given their vision of story, that's okay, but this isn't a place to proselytize. I don't have to proselytize. If I can get them interested in those authors will continue to speak long after I'm gone. So anyway, but they said you can answer any question our artists ask. I give my lecture, first question. Weren't Lewis and Tolkien Christians? Could you tell us about that? Second question, isn't Aslan a Christ figure in the Narnian books? Could you tell us about that? Does Tolkien have any Christ figures, like when Gandalf the Grey gives up his life to save his fellowship from the Balrog and then comes back as Gandalf the White? Sounds like death and resurrection to me. Is that a Christian image? Are there others? Every question was on that line. The lecture's over and they're going out. 20 artists come up to talk to me. And they said, you're a Christian, aren't you? And I noticed they were the ones that had been asking me the questions. I said, are you Christians? They said, we are. That's why we were asking you the questions. They were trying to witness to their friends. And I said, I have a question for you. How did greater love than this, that no man hath, than he laid down his life for his friends, get into the Jungle Book? They said, oh, we've been smuggling stuff in for years. But they said, but other people have been smuggling other stuff in. But here's a story that is so remarkable that most of our sense of story is drawn from that great story of one laying down his life for another. You told me you like Les Mis. Les Mis is about that. The bishop gives the candelabrum, and then John Valjean plays it forward, and so on. The high courtesy of heaven, I give my life for you. So James Cameron, do you know him, the movie maker? I've never heard him interview where he doesn't, even if it's not part of the interview, take a swipe at Christians. And yet all the movies he makes are our story. Terminator 2, an alien comes from another world and lays down his life to save the woman and her child. Titanic, a guy named Jack wins a ticket to the doomed ship. He's incarnated onto the ship and goes immediately to the bow of the ship, makes the shape of the cross and says, I'm king of the world. There's a woman stuck on that ship, and she's caught in circumstances not of her making. Her father's died, left them penniless, and the mother says, I will never be a washerwoman. Promises her in marriage to a rich guy who's the devil incarnate. And she goes to the stern of the ship because she knows she's not going to make it. She's going to throw herself off. Jack just happens to be here and saves her. They bring back the old lady to hear the story of the night the ship went down. They say, we have no record of him in the ship's roster. And she says, isn't that amazing? But he saved me in every way. Does that sound vaguely familiar to you, that story? And then what's the next movie he makes? Avatar. A guy takes on the flesh of the people in that world and saves those people, enfleshed in their world. What does Avatar mean in Sanskrit? Incarnation. Here's a guy who doesn't like Christians, but he's fascinated with our story. Either he knows it's always a story that works and people pay to come see it, or else he doesn't like Christians, but he's fascinated by our story and he's maybe in process. Pray for him. But there's the story. And Lewis was caught in that. He loved the story before he understood the gospel, but eventually he understands.
So let me just ask then, are you, because a lot of the imagery is, I would argue, is lost on most people. Their imaginations have not been cultivated, not been developed, not been disciplined, whatever. What would you say to people who are not aware of the stories that are animating their world or their TV or their books or whatever? Is there a way that, you said you didn't have your kids watching TV. You're making a statement about something there. So would Lewis look at this world and say, our imagination is better or our imagination is less developed? And how would he want our imaginations developed?
Again, I don't like to put words in Lewis's mouth, but I think if he looked at the world that we're living in, he would think it was less developed because we let other people do our imagining for us. You see kids walking around their little video things and whatnot, and they're watching these, and they're not given an opportunity to really have books read to them out loud. And I still see, my grandkids, man, they love to sit and listen to stories when they're told. So we're in some senses cheating them because it's easier for us to hand them a video thing and let them watch something. So I think that there is loss. But here's the thing too. Lewis said in his literary critical judgments, never judge a book till you've at least read it. I remember all kinds of people during the Harry Potter thing. I had a guy call me up and he says, Jerry, I know you like Lewis and stuff. You got to help us get Harry Potter out of the schools. We're trying to get Harry Potter out of the schools. And maybe you could help me. And I said, well, I don't know if I can. I haven't read them. My wife read them. My kids read them. They all loved them. Maybe I can help you, but let me ask you this. What did you think when you read them? He said, well, I didn't read them. And I said, yeah, I can help you get out of that controversy. You haven't read the books. You don't belong there. If there's a controversy, make sure you're informed about it before you start spewing and talking about it and so on. But Lewis says, read a book before you judge the book. But then when you read it, is there a place where you found yourself getting particularly moved by that book or that movie? And if there is, go back and revisit that and ask yourself imaginatively, what was it about that scene? And take and embellish the scene. I'll give you an example. I was on an airplane one time. I'm a high T on the Myers-Briggs. I live in my head. And I'm in a family of 5 feelers. You know, they're just always beating on me, you know. So I'm on this airplane and I watch this movie. It's hard to recommend a movie you saw on an airplane because you don't know how much they might have sanitized it. I'm watching this movie and there came this scene towards the end of the movie and I burst into tears. Just sobbing. And it's so unlike me, and I'm going, what was it about that scene? So I went back after the movie was over and imaginatively said, what was depicted there? The movie I have in mind is The Notebook. Everybody laughs when I say that because it's a chick flick. I want you to know I'm secure enough in my masculinity that I can watch a chick flick. So anyway, it's a movie where there's this old man who goes to a memory care unit to talk to this old woman, read a story to her, and she's standoffish, and the orderly says, okay, he comes and reads every day. And the impression made is this old man in his retirement goes to the memory care unit and reads stories to old people. And the whole time is present time, James Garner reading to this old woman, Gina Rollins, this story, and flashback the time of the story. And it's about a boy and a girl in a town near Charleston, South Carolina, boy played by Ryan Gosling, his first big movie, and Rachel McAdams, her first big movie. And everything counts against any relationship ever working between these two. He's from the town, she's not. She's come there for the summer, to summer with her family. Obviously, they're of wealth that they could do that. He's from a poor family. Her family's all together, very pretentious, but all together. We never see the mother. We don't know if she died or if she abandoned the family. He's bright, he's got a high school diploma, and he likes reading the poetry of Walt Whitman. She's got the best education her parents could buy. So many things counting against any relationship developing between these two. But it does. Summer romance emerges. When the parents find out about it, they're going to get that girl out of there because they got plans for their daughter. And as they're leaving, he's weeping, running after the car. She's weeping in the car. He yells to her, I will write to you every day. Mother hears it. She's every day at the post office box before the girl could get there and intercepts every letter, more counting against this relationship ever working. Then World War II breaks out, and all of a sudden, more distance. And it's at that moment that the director tips his hand, and you realize it's this old man and this old lady's story. And he goes every day to read her the story. The last scene, almost the last scene. He's finishing up the story after a whole day. There's a tablecloth over the Formica table in the hospital. There's a rose and a bud vase, a candle's burning, a nice dinner, and a record player playing all the music that informed their relationship. And the whole environment is pulsating out to the woman, the love of this man for her. He finishes the story, and she says, that's the most beautiful love story I've ever heard. And it sounds so familiar. And at that moment, cognition washes across her face. She says, it's our story, isn't it? He says, yeah. She says, how much time do we have? He says, last time it was only 5 minutes. She says, how are the children? That's a question a mother would ask, isn't it? He said, they're fine. They came to see you today. She says, tell them I love them. He says, I will. The music's playing. She says, hold me. Dance with me across the floor. And while they're dancing, as quickly as she came into cognition, she falls back out of cognition, and she starts screaming, finding herself in the arms of a stranger. Orderlies have to come in and sedate her. James Garner's character is standing there, biting his knuckle, weeping. And at that moment, I just totally lost it. What was it about that scene? And as I went back and tried to imaginatively reflect, I realized this is all of our stories. We're all part of what looks like an impossible love relationship. So many things count against it. And yet we're constantly being told the story over and over and over again. And once in a while we come to a moment of cognition, and it's so precious. And then a little inconvenience happens, and we fall back into our dementia. I think it's our story. And we find our story in so many dimensions reflected in the great literature, because even the great artists and writers, they have these heart feelings about what it is to be human and what is the quest of our humanity. And it's to long to have restored the estrangement that occurred at the fall. So Lewis buys into that. I do too.
So we have just a few minutes left. I'm going to ask my final 5 questions, and the rapid 5 questions. So these are brief answers to the extent that
You
you
think I
can
could
give
give a
brief
brief
answers?
answer?
No, no, I don't, but whatever. What, if anything, keeps you up at night?
One thing, I will not go to bed until I've prayed. And I have a long list of people I pray for. I pray for at least an hour every day. And I will not abandon those people. And not just family, but friends and acquaintances of friends. People have asked me for requests. I write them down, and I pray through that list. And that's what keeps me up at night. And I feel maybe it's my highest calling in life, to care for those people and pray for them. And I always end my prayers. Then finally, when I get to bed and I lay my head on my bed, on my pillow, the last prayer I try to pray, unless I fall asleep real quick and don't get it in, the last prayer I pray is I say this: "Oh, Jesus, I love you. I'm not good at it, but I am so grateful you make it so easy for me to do because of your great love for me. I love you, Lord." And that's how I end my day.
Thank you. I don't like my other questions after that powerful answer.
If you have questions when this is over, I will stay here till the last person goes. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have afterwards. I'm eager to serve.
Thank you. I have a few more questions.
Okay.
They're a little bit less profound than that, but you might have a profound answer. What are you reading right now?
Right now I'm rereading. I always read my Bible. I read through it once or twice a year. I've read it 56 times, and I've read my New Testament another 45 times besides that. And my Greek Bible I've read twice. I'm on my third read of the Greek Bible. I'm no Greek scholar, but I can get by if I have a lexicon close by my elbow, and I get better every year at it. So I read that always. That's central. But I'm rereading Lewis's literary critical essays. So selected literary essays and his studies of medieval and Renaissance literature. I've read them many times before, but I like reading them. I'm also reading David Brooks's new book, the one on it's like
How to Know a Person.
Huh?
How to Know a Person?
How to Know a Person.
I started that, yeah.
And I know him. He's a friend, actually.
Okay.
But his writing, when he wrote, he came to faith while he was writing, not the second mountain, but the one just before it, Road to Character. He came to faith. If you read the chapter on Augustine, he came to faith while he was writing that. And I think I asked Jesus in my heart all over again after I read that chapter. But I like his writing.
So 25 years ago, I was reading in his column in the New York Times, and he said Tim Russert had Al Sharpton and Jerry Falwell on Meet the Press or whatever the program was, and he wanted to talk to him about the church. And he said, shame on Tim Russert, who cares what Al Sharpton or Tim or Jerry Falwell think about the church. If you want to talk to the Protestant Pope, his name is John Stott. Mm-hmm. And then he said, I've read everything Stott has written.
Yeah.
I mean, Stott has written 50 books.
Yeah.
And I'm like, are you kidding me? So I called a friend who's the president of John Stott Ministries, and I said, are you reading this Brooks column? I mean, he says he's read everything by John Stott. And he goes, yeah. He said John Stott, Uncle John, as we got to call him, Uncle John reached out to David Brooks years ago and has been writing to him. And they've developed a friendship. Yeah. And he said he's not going to talk about it. He goes, but pray for David Brooks. He's clearly on a pilgrimage. So for the next 25 years, I was watching this, yes, because his books would show more and more enlightenment into spiritual truth. Yeah,
he's amazing. On my daily prayer list. His wife was a student of mine at Wheaton, and he came to Wheaton and gave a lecture and told that John Stott story. And I waited afterwards, this was in 2008, and I said, you talk about these people you know in D.C. Everybody had left, so just him and me. And I said, you talk about these people in D.C. you know who are people of faith. Has any of them ever tried to buttonhole you? And he said, you mean convert me? And I said, yeah. He said, only one. I said, who was it? Who was the one Christian that you mattered so much to him that he would share the faith with you? And he said, John Stott. And I said, what happened? And he said, I can't tell you. I can't tell you. So I didn't know what that meant. And I didn't really get to know him till 2 years later. And then later we were able to carry out that conversation further. But there's real faith in him. And he's very Lewisian in that he is a faith-integrated writer now. And I don't know if you want to see something by him, it reminds you a little bit of Lewis, actually. He doesn't write fiction, to my knowledge, but his prose is perceptive, and his nonfiction is as perceptive. But you can see the Trinity Forum. Just Google Trinity Forum and watch some of the interviews or some of the presentations of David Brooks.
A couple years ago, I had a friend, I will not say his name, and he's not a close friend, but he's a friend, and I saw him at this event, and I said, hey, can you tell me, has David Brooks come to faith? And he said, well, Mike, what does one know about such things, the heart of other people? And I said, yeah. I said, I don't know anything about David Brooks' heart. I said, but I think you might. And he didn't say anything. I said, do you know David Brooks? And he says, I do. And I said, have you been with him recently? And he said, I have. And I said, okay. I said, so I was at an event that Brooks was at. There was, I don't know, just David and 5,000 other people and me. I said, so are you talking about that? He goes, no, there were, he goes, I guess 10 of us. And I said, okay, so who are the 10? He looks at me and he says, well, Bono asked if I would lead a devotion for you two before the concert. And Brooks was there. And I'm like, Bono asked you if you would lead a devotion. You sort of buried the lead there. And I said, and Brooks was there. And I said, he was. And I said, so has he come to faith? And he doesn't want to talk, which is why Bono would invite him and why I'm not giving his name, because he would be mad if I ratted him out that way. But he said, I heard Brooks on a TV program, and he said that he's been reading this Jewish mystic, and he's been reading C.S. Lewis, and that he has a faith. But I go, he's very nondescript, and he said, when somebody pressed him on it, he said, the grass is too new, I don't want anybody to walk on it. And my friend said, that's Tim Keller's language.
Yeah.
And I said, oh, okay. So I took it at that Brooks had made a decision for Christ.
He was with Keller fairly regularly. They met with some degree of regularity. But that's the point, though. You don't
Do you remember when I said these were going to be the short questions?
Well, but you don't want to divulge confidences of another person. The things I told you about David Brooks, I know things.
Yeah.
But I won't talk about them. But the things I do talk about publicly are things he said publicly. And I think that's important.
So Brooks's book, some of Lewis's scholarly literature, in addition to the Bible, and
not in addition to the Bible. The others are in addition.
Okay,
yeah, they're the addition.
Yes, good call. Is there a book or a podcast or something that you're recommending right now, a movie, a play, anything that you, more than other things you have been recommending?
You know what, I don't listen to podcasts. It's because I'm technically challenged. I'm not good at that stuff.
I don't think Lewis would have listened to podcasts either. I don't think Lewis would have listened to podcasts.
He might have, I don't know. He listened to discussions with his friends and stuff. So maybe he would have, I don't know.
It seems like he would be more sitting down with friends, at the Eagle and Child or something else, as opposed to...
The nature of the academic life is you almost have to have a degree of technological savvy. I'm borderline dyslexic, and I only recently learned that the no switch on my computer meant on.
Oh.
So I don't know what Lewis would have done.
We walked right into that one. Yeah. Okay. Final question. What are you working on now? So you had a book come out not too long ago on Lewis and the Imagination, and then you wrote another book since then.
It's called The Splendor in the Dark, and it's an analysis of one of his two books that he wrote before he was a Christian, the narrative poem Dimer. It's a 100-page long poem. And I think it's really important to see where Lewis is at on the cusp of his coming to faith.
And I've tried to read it. It seems very dark.
Oh, I like the book, though. I think it's a well-written poem. But I'm
I'm not talking about your book. I'm saying the poem, the Dimer poem. I thought was pretty.
Well, I gave these lectures at Wheaton College, and 3 lectures, and each one was responded to by another prof. I never laughed so much in my life.